Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to get started. Christine Chen is having a little bit of technical difficulties, so she's going to get on as soon as she can. But in the interest of time, we're going to get started with our presentation. We'll have about 20 minutes of presentation. We'll be monitoring the questions that you type in the chat window, and we will address them in the Q&A. So to get started, thank you for joining us today. We're excited to present the results of the fall 2016 National Asian American Survey. And this report is called Asian American Voices in the 2016 Election. You will find the report on our website, naasurvey.com. You will also see the complete slide deck. We don't have time to go through all of the slides today, but we have information there, especially in terms of state-level data and other detailed data that we won't have the time to go over today. So let's just get started. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm the director of the National Asian American Survey. Also joining us today are Janelle Wong from University of Maryland, Taeku Lee from University of California, Berkeley, and Jennifer Lee, University of California, Irvine. So in terms of background facts about the AAPI electorate, here's just a few to keep in mind. Since 2000, the number of Asian American voters has grown by about 600,000 voters in each presidential cycle. And chances are it's going to be even greater this year given the rapid growth of the Asian American population, as well as strong registration efforts this year. Since 2000, the number of Asian American and Pacific Islander eligible voters has grown by more than 1 million in each presidential cycle. And many of you know these statistics by now in terms of AAPIs being the fastest growing populations in the country, and not only between 2000 and 2010, but also since 2010. Asian Americans have been growing at a rate of 18% and Pacific Islanders at 12%. APIs are growing even faster in states like Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. These also happen to be states that are important in the presidential election this year. In terms of state-level politics and potential impact, APIs are 5% or more of the eligible voter population in 9 states: Hawaii, California, Nevada, Washington, New Jersey, New York, Alaska, Maryland, and Virginia. Some of the key findings we have here is the Democratic Party advantage among Asian Americans has grown since 2012. And compared to the national average, Asian American registered voters hold more favorable views of Obama and Clinton and much more unfavorable views of Trump. 55% of Asian American registered voters intend to vote for Clinton, 14% for Trump, 8% for some other candidate, and the remaining undecided. After taking into account undecideds who lean towards each candidate, we project an election day Clinton advantage over Trump of 70% to 20%, with 10% for other candidates. Now, this is an unusual election year, so it's possible, given both Johnson and Stein, that those figures, especially that 10% figure, might be smaller on election day than what we're projecting today. Clinton is on track to match or beat Obama's performance in 2012, when he won a record share of the Asian American electorate. So that's the background. I'm not going to go over this slide too much, just in the interest of time. In addition to the questions on presidential vote choice, we also have questions about congressional vote choice. We also ask about the most important questions facing the country and facing Asian Americans personally. And finally, we also ask questions about media usage, where they get their sources of political information. We ask about ethnic media. We also ask about engagement in social media. In terms of the methodology, this is based on a larger survey of 2,238 adult individuals who are Asian Americans. In the report, we also show some numbers about Pacific Islanders. There are 350 Pacific Islander adults and a smaller number, about 260 Pacific Islander registered voters. What we're presenting here primarily are Asian American registered voters, and we have 1,694 Asian American registered voters that form the basis of our analysis. The survey is based on telephone interviews, dialing listed samples available from Catalyst using registered voter and commercial vendor samples, and classified for ethnicity by name, listed race where applicable, and track level ethnic concentration. Catalyst has been improving its methodology on Asian American name classification over the last few years, working with community partners to improve the accuracy of their name classifications, but also in terms of their geographic analysis that goes into their ethnic model. We covered both landlines as well as cell phones, so about 70% landline and close to 30% cell phones. Overall margin of error, which includes the design effect in terms of weighting, is plus or minus 3.5%. And there you see the national origin groups that we have. These are numbers for the registered voters in our sample. We have even more when we consider all adults. And in a future report, we will be looking at civic engagement among all adults and opinion among all adults. That's not the focus of this presentation today. We will also have a subsequent presentation that focuses specifically on the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population and making comparisons between NHPIs and Asian Americans. But if you look at the report, we do have a few data points where we reveal the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander numbers in terms of presidential vote choice and party identification. The data are weighted by ethnicity and gender, state of residence, education, and nativity using a successive ranking method. So first, in terms of party identification, the way we ask this question is the way that survey researchers typically ask it. Generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or in terms of some other party? And what we do, when you see the nonpartisan here, it combines those who say that they're independent with those who say that they don't know. And so this finding in some ways is similar to what we found before with a large proportion of Asian Americans that do not identify with either party, the ones we call nonpartisans here. But we have seen that since 2008 and since 2012, the proportion of Asian American registered voters who self-identify as Democrat has increased significantly. In terms of other breakdowns in party ID, we find that women and the native-born are more likely to identify as Democrats, women more likely than men to identify as Democrats, and the native-born more likely than the foreign-born to identify as Democrats. Now, among those who say that they're independent or they don't know, they are asked a subsequent question to see if they feel closer to either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And we see a dramatic difference from the previous findings. So I'll just show you that again. This is without the leaners. You see that the nonpartisans are 41%. If you take into account how the nonpartisans are leaning, we find that a majority of Asian Americans identify as, Asian American registered voters identify as Democrat, 57%. Only 24% is Republican, and 18% who political scientists would call pure independents. Those who say that they're independent or that they don't know where they stand on the parties and do not say that they feel closer to either party. Overall, Democrats hold more than 2-to-1 advantage among Asian Americans, and the Democratic Party advantage holds across all ethnic groups, including Vietnamese Americans. And this is an important point we can go over in the Q&A. Next, we have favorability ratings, and I'll turn it over to Teku Lee.
Great. Thank you, Karthik, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be your tour guide through the slides of our key findings on two parts of our study, favorability ratings and vote choice. Vote choice both in the presidential race and in the congressional races. So if party identification is the skeleton that frames a person's politics, favorability ratings are the muscle that gives strength and shape to that frame. So we asked about favorability towards both political parties, towards the outgoing President Barack Obama, and towards the two major party candidates vying to replace him in the Oval Office, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I'm only going to discuss the findings from our study about Obama, Clinton, and Trump. And overall, the story is one that Karthik has already highlighted in the executive summary, that Asian Americans remain among the most ardent supporters of the president of any group, with favorability towards Clinton lagging not too far behind, and then a completely different story of active dislike towards Donald Trump. So on the Obama slide, as you can see, if you add those who are somewhat favorable and very favorable, more than 2 out of 3, 68% of Asian Americans have a favorable view of the president, and that is higher than the current U.S. average of about 53%. And you'll also see that for almost every group, when you break up the data by Asian ethnic national origin subgroups, have a very favorable view of the president, with groups like Asian Indians and Hmong Americans in the upper 80s in terms of their favorability ratings. There's one exception, as you see at the bottom of the slide, and that is Vietnamese Americans. And in that group, only 34% have a favorable view of the president and 60% have an unfavorable view. Can we move to the next slide, please? So when we break that down by the 3 demographic groups that we will show data on for most of this presentation, that is generation, where we break up Asian American millennials, 18 to 34-year-olds, from everybody else in our sample, 35 years and older, gender, males and females, and then native-born and foreign-born. We see that there's a somewhat greater favorability, especially in the very favorable category, among Asian American millennials and among the native-born. Next slide, please. So when we move to favorability ratings of Donald Trump, all you need to do to understand this slide is to focus your eyes on the dark red. That's the very unfavorable. And you can see that that is a color that dominates this slide. So 67% of Asian Americans have an unfavorable view of Donald Trump, and a majority, 52%, have a very unfavorable view towards Donald Trump. Again, there's one group here that's the exception, and that is Vietnamese Americans. Among Vietnamese Americans, there's a roughly even split between the favorables and the unfavorables. So that's 45% to 43%. Next slide, please. When we break that down by demographic groups, I think the finding that really pops in this slide is among the millennials and native-born. And I should say that in our sample of Asian American registered voters, the native-born category is heavily weighted towards those who are 18 to 34 years old. And you can see in this slide that Donald Trump is especially disliked among Asian American millennials and those born in the United States. Next slide, please. When we turn to favorability ratings towards Hillary Clinton, you can see a story that is a bit closer to the Obama story. So overall, 59% of Asian American registered voters have a favorable view towards Hillary Clinton. And favorability ratings are pretty high across the board, again, with the exception of Vietnamese Americans, who are pretty unfavorable relative to favorable in their views of Hillary Clinton. Next slide, please. When we show the 3 demographic breakdowns, again, I think one thing that really jumps out in this slide is there is a noticeable enthusiasm gap for Hillary Clinton among the millennials. So for President Obama, the favorability in the very favorable category, millennials were even more favorable than those 35 and older. And for Hillary Clinton, it's the opposite. So those Asian American millennial registered voters are significantly less very favorable towards Clinton than are Asian Americans who are 35 years or older. We also see a similar pattern in terms of the nativity breakdown. And then the last thing I would say on this slide is Asian American women registered voters seem to be more enthusiastic about Clinton, in the sense that 31% are very favorable towards her by comparison to Asian American male registered voters, only 20% of whom are very favorable towards Clinton. Okay, next slide, please. So now we have the drum roll slides, which is about the presidential vote. Next slide. So as you can see, Hillary Clinton's support among Asian American registered voters is very dramatically in favor of Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. So the margin here, if you just look at the two-way, is 55% to 14%. And that is nearly a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of support for Clinton relative to support for Donald Trump. You'll also notice that about 8% of our registered voters indicate that they are likely to vote for a third-party candidate, either Jill Stein or Gary Johnson. And 23% either did not yet know how they would vote or refused to share with us how they are likely to vote. And that 23% is a high figure, especially compared to the media horse race polls that you see today, which typically run at about 3 to 5% who do not yet know how they will vote. But we do want to note that this 23% mark is actually a lot lower than the comparable figures for Asian American registered voters in 2012. When we ran our 2012 survey, somewhere between 35 and 40% of Asian American registered voters were undecided or refused to say how they would vote. So in a sense, the 2016 election has given Asian Americans a lot more information to work with in terms of deciding how they're going to vote in the presidential election. The last thing on this slide is that Clinton outpolls Trump among every single group, including Vietnamese Americans. So Clinton's margin over Trump, even among Vietnamese Americans who were split in their favorability ratings, is 41% to 16%. Next slide, please. The demographic breakdown shows that Clinton's dominance among Asian Americans is basically sweeping. There is no segment where Trump appears to resonate. And this is true not only in terms of what's shown in this slide, age, gender, and nativity, but it's also true when we break down the presidential vote choice question by education and by income group. Next slide, please. So we spent a bit of time on party identification. So you might ask, how do we predict the Asian American vote will break down between Democrats, Republicans, and independents? And as you see from this slide, Clinton absolutely, for the lack of a better way of saying it, crushes Donald Trump among Democrats, 84%. And you can't see that figure there on this slide, but it's 84% to 1%. So let me say that again, 1%. That's not quite the 0% that some polls have found for African American support for Trump in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but it's pretty close. So there are very, 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 very few Asian American Democrats who are thinking of voting for Donald Trump in 2016. Now, when you turn to the Republican identifying row, you'll see that Trump does enjoy a significant advantage among Asian American registered voters who identify as Republicans, but the margin is significantly smaller than it is on the Democratic side. The other way of putting that is to say 1 out of 8 Asian American registered voters who identify as Republican are telling us they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton instead of their party's nominee, Donald Trump. And that 12% figure is almost certainly going to actually be higher because nearly 30% of Asian American registered voters who are Republicans are in the don't know or refused category. And finally, if you look at the nonpartisan row, even among nonpartisan and independents, Clinton far outpolls Donald Trump by a nearly 4-to-1 margin. Next slide, please. So we saw that many nonpartisans lean towards one party. So what happens when we include leaners into the mix? And we see that Clinton's support exceeds now the 50% threshold among all groups with the exception of Vietnamese Americans. And with Vietnamese Americans, you can see that 29% are in the don't know or refuse category. So even among Vietnamese Americans, it's a safe bet to say that a solid majority of Vietnamese Americans will be voting for Hillary Clinton this November. Next slide, please. So As I noted earlier, with Asian Americans in the surveys that we have conducted this year and in 2008 and 2012, a very large proportion relative to the general U.S. electorate are either undecided or are unwilling to share how they are likely to vote. So what if we pull them out of the analysis? If we do that, what this slide shows is that Clinton will enjoy a 70-20 margin over Donald Trump. And if we extrapolate that 70-20 margin to a two-way vote prediction, or if you extrapolate the earlier 59% to 16% margin, we would predict that Hillary Clinton would win between 78 and 79% of the Asian American vote. And that is an even more overwhelming margin than President Obama enjoyed in 2012. Next slide, please. How about congressional races? Next slide, please. The picture is largely the same. So Asian Americans indicate that they are likely to vote for a Democratic congressional candidate in margins that far outnumber Asian Americans who indicate that they intend to vote for a Republican congressional candidate. The margin here is 55% to 22%. It's not as big as the margin that Clinton enjoys over Trump, but it is still a very, very substantial margin. And you'll notice here, if you look across the rows, that all Asian American national origin groups are more favorable towards Democratic candidates than Republican House candidates. And the only group that comes close to splitting their vote here are Vietnamese Americans, 34% to 31%, in a slight nod to Democratic House candidates. But I should say that 3 percentage point difference is not within our margin of error. Next slide, please. So one notable difference in how the vote splits by demographic background is in the millennials again. So here millennials are much more supportive of Democrats for Congress than those who are 35 years or older. And as with some of the other slides, I think when you look at the nativity split, that is also largely reflecting this generational split of younger Asian Americans being very inclined to vote for Democratic candidates, not just for the presidential race, but also for congressional races. So now to discuss where Asian American registered voters in 2016 stand on the issues, let me hand off to Jennifer Lee.
Hi there. Thank you, Taiku, and thank you, Karthik. And we're really excited to present some results on what Asian Americans think is the most important problem facing the country and what Asian Americans think is personally most important to them. So the first slide you'll see here are results from 2 questions that we asked our respondents following the question wording from a Gallup poll. What we asked were, what are the most important problems facing the United States today, and what issue is the most important to you personally? And what we did here was we didn't have a preset list of answers. We allowed the respondents to say whatever came to mind, and these are the things that they mentioned. Like other racial groups, Asian Americans were most likely to mention jobs and the economy, but they also mention problems like national security, racism, the government, and immigration as the most important problems facing the country. And I should note here, we don't have this slide here, but in the report we mentioned that the concern over racism is really driven by Asian American millennial voters, 23% of whom rank it as one of the most important problems facing the United States today. We should also say for Asian Americans personally, they mention healthcare and education as the most important problems facing them personally, other than jobs and the economy. And here, I think it's important to note that on the question of education, one of the interesting findings is that Cambodian and Hmong Americans were the most likely to mention education as one of the most important problems that they face, which is critical because they have the lowest levels of educational attainment of all Asian American groups. Next slide. We also asked The survey respondents, their opinion about a variety of issues and policy preferences, including their opinion on the Affordable Care Act. And here, as you can see from the first bar on the slide, 60% of Asian Americans favor or support the Affordable Care Act, and support is strong among all Asian ethnic groups by age, by gender, and nativity, which we show more fully in the report. And support has been strong since 2012. One of the things we did find that we don't show on this graph is that where there is a divide, it falls along partisan lines, that 82% of registered Democrats are supportive, while only 22% of registered Republicans are supportive. But despite these differences, the main takeaway here is that 3 out of 5 Asian American registered voters support the Affordable Care Act, which is even higher than the national average at about 44%. So next slide, please. So the next question we asked about was whether the Asian American registered voters increased federal assistance for college, and you can see the exact question wording to the left. And here, support is uniformly strong among Asian Americans. 2/3 of Asian American registered voters support this, and support is particularly strong among Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Hmong Americans, and these are groups that have the lowest rates of college attendance among Asian Americans. It's also interesting to note that groups like Indian Americans and Korean Americans who have high levels of college completion also demonstrate high support for this program. And why this is important is that it indicates that self-interest doesn't always guide Asian American support for federal programs like increased assistance for college attendance. And again, we don't show this, but you'll see this more fully in the report, that Asian American millennials and U.S.-born Asian Americans are especially supportive. Next slide, please. We also asked a question about whether Asian Americans support a ban of Muslims from entering the United States. And here it was really interesting to see that very few Asian Americans support the ban. Only 20% support a banning Muslims from entering the United States, and 62% oppose this proposed policy. And Asian Americans are more likely to oppose this policy than the national average at about 49%. The opposition to the ban is strongest among Asian Indians, Hmong Americans, and the Japanese, and it's also particularly strong among younger Asian Americans, those between the ages of 18 and 34, and also U.S.-born Asian Americans. And we don't show this in the slide, but we also found some interesting educational differences. So Asian Americans with no formal education were most likely to support the ban, while those with a professional degree or a college degree were least likely to support it. Next slide, please. On the question of accepting Syrian refugees, here is where the data is more mixed, in that Asian Americans are divided both by ethnic group and by age. While 44% of Asian Americans support accepting Syrian refugees, 35% oppose the idea. Among those who are most supportive are Hmong Americans. Among those least supportive are Filipino Americans. Just over 1/3 of Filipino Americans support accepting Syrian refugees in the United States. One of the curious findings from this question was where Vietnamese Americans stood on the question. As many of you know, Vietnamese Americans are predominantly a refugee group in the United States, but they are also among the least likely to say they support accepting Syrian refugees in the United States at 38%. And to give you a national comparison, about 43% of registered voters nationwide support accepting Syrian refugees in the United States. So even though there's a lot of division among Asian Americans on the whole Asian Americans look like the national average? Again, as we detail in the report, Asian American millennials and those who are U.S. born are much more supportive of acceptance hearing refugees than their older and foreign-born counterparts. And to talk about some other policies, I will hand it off to Janelle Wong of the University of Maryland.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you all for joining us today. All right, so we are turning now to one of the more controversial domestic issues, and that is marijuana legalization. Here we see that Asian Americans break a bit with their progressive leanings overall, and what we see here is that 56% of Asian Americans, a majority, oppose legalizing even small amounts of marijuana for personal use. And what's interesting in this chart is that you see that people are not really undecided or don't know about this question. They actually feel pretty strong in their viewpoints, 36% supporting this policy. We also noticed that the support for legalization is strongest among Asian Indians, and the opposition is strongest among Filipinos, Koreans, and Vietnamese Americans. What we also show in the report is that young people, not surprisingly, are much more supportive of marijuana legalization than are their older counterparts, and the first generation correspondingly is also very supportive. Next slide, please. When it comes to climate change, the question we ask is, do you support or oppose setting stricter emission limits on power plants to address climate change? This is a question used by other surveys, and what we see here, you can see this kind of sea of blue, is that Asian Americans are really environmentalists at heart, and I say this because this is very much in line with previous surveys. We see that Asian Americans, though they don't get much attention on the issue of environmentalism, actually express very consistently strong support for pro-environment policies. Next slide, please. This is some new data, and the question we ask is, do you support or oppose the government doing more to give blacks equal rights with whites? And here we see overwhelmingly support for this kind of policy. I think what is important to emphasize here is that the government doing more suggests structural or policy-related interventions. And on this kind of strong intervention by the government, we see that a majority of every Asian American group supports government intervention to ensure racial justice and racial equality. Support is strongest among Cambodians, Koreans, and Asian Indians. Next slide, please. So I'll also say that the younger Asian Americans were also, not surprisingly, more supportive of government intervention to give blacks equal rights with whites. Next slide, please, Karthik. So we're going to turn from those policy questions to where Asian Americans are learning about the election this season. And here we, next slide, please, see that Asian Americans are most likely to turn to the internet and social media for information about politics. We see that about 66%, if you look at that first bar, those who turn to the internet and social media a lot, or at least a moderate amount, it's about 66% rely on the internet for information about politics. And this is followed then by more traditional sources such as television, radio, and magazines. We also note that family and friends tend to be, the social network of Asian Americans tends to be an important source of information about politics for Asian Americans, with more than 50% relying on family and friends, either a lot, a great deal, or a moderate amount. And we asked a follow-up question here we were curious about whether Asian Americans turn to the older generation or ask younger people, their younger family members, about politics. What we found is really most, if they do rely on family and friends, they're more likely to rely on their peers, for their generational peers, for information about politics. Next slide, please. Something that we have long emphasized, and that is a very consistent finding in this series of surveys, is that ethnic media tends to be really critical for Asian Americans who are trying to learn more about politics. So here we see that 1 in 3 Asian Americans relies on ethnic media to get their information, their political news. And this is particularly high among Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. These groups also tend to have very high limited English proficiency rates compared to other groups. This also compares to Latino respondents in recent studies. About 20% of that group also relies on ethnic media. And we see that this is a consistent trend even among groups that are more settled in the United States. We see that still some proportion relies on ethnic media or both ethnic and mainstream media. So if you look at Japanese, for instance, still almost 1 out of 10 rely on both sources of media rather than mainstream media alone. Next slide, please. And of course, there are some other demographic differences that are expected in terms of age and generation. Here, though, we also see that women are more likely to rely on ethnic media than men. So that's something that really stands out here. All right, next slide. Finally, we looked at social media engagement. And this question was adapted from previous surveys. In the last 12 months, have you posted or commented about politics on social media like Facebook, Twitter, and we also included WeChat or Kakao Talk for specific groups? And what we see is that there are pretty significant variations across the Asian American population when it comes to social media. They aren't surprising variations, but younger Asian Americans are more likely to post and to engage in social media when it comes to politics, and the native-born are more likely to. Next slide, please. So our last set of questions had to do with mobilization, and I think this is particularly important for community organizations that are trying to get out the vote. We see some very consistent patterns over time, but I want to revisit them for this election. Next slide, please. So here we asked Asian Americans whether or not the parties came around to talk to them or called them to talk to them about the current election campaign. And we see that only 30% of all Asian American registered voters, these are registered voters, so they should be falling into the contact bucket for both parties. We find that 30% of Asian American registered voters report being contacted. This is similar. It hasn't changed since 2012, so we don't see an increase in contact. And if we can kind of extrapolate from that election, we know that 43% of whites and 40% of blacks were contacted by one of the parties in 2012. So Asian Americans still seem to be under-mobilized by the two major parties. This means that the work of community organizations is really filling in the gap here, can be especially critical for Asian Americans. Next slide, please. So the other thing that really stood out in this analysis is the partisan kind of contrast in terms of which group is contacting Asian Americans. So we see that among those, this is only those who were contacted by a party, Asian Americans are much more likely to be contacted by the Democrats than the Republicans. So the first bar shows those who were contacted only by the Democratic Party. The third bar shows those who were contacted by both parties. And we see in the middle that only 16% of Asian Americans were likely to be contacted by the Republican Party. This shows I think, driver of some of the partisan patterns we started this presentation with. So with that, I want to, and since we're talking about mobilization, I want to turn this conversation over to Christine Chen, who is the Executive Director of AAPIA Vote, one of the major mobilizers in the Asian American community during this election season.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We are now going to head into the Q&A session. You can go ahead and type in your question, or you can also raise your hand, and I could unmute you for you to ask your question. But in the meanwhile, we'll kick it off with a few of our questions that we have already. Grace had asked, were all the interviews conducted in English? If not, what other languages? And I will also ask another question from Chimbo, is what do you think is motivating the decline, diminished favorability of Republican ID, candidate favorability among Vietnamese? Are we seeing party alignment toward the Democrat ID across all generations, or is it among native-born Vietnamese?
So I'll take the first question, and I don't know if Taeku Lee has his data handy and can crunch some of those numbers. We can certainly get back on some of these these more detailed questions about generation within ethnicity. In terms of the languages that were supported, you can find it on our website. It's English. We have Spanish in there, but there were no APIs that took it. We did comparison samples of Latinos, Blacks, and whites, and we're still in the process of collecting that data. In terms of Asian languages, we had Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian, Hindi, and Tagalog. Taeko, do you want to say something about Vietnamese? I think for one thing, before Taeko gets on, is the Vietnamese population seems to be in a state of flux, and over time in different surveys, they do seem to be trending Democratic, but it's not a strong identification by any means.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the general story is if you rewind your time clock one full generation back to the 1990s and looked at any survey data or exit poll data on Vietnamese Americans, you would find a group that was very heavily Republican in their voting habits and significantly more Republican than Democrat in their party identification. And according to our National Asian American Survey data, in 2008 and 2012, we started to see a very different story of a group that is a lot more split in their partisanship, and if anything, in terms of their actual voting behavior when it comes down to choosing between the two party candidates, given that they have high unfavorability, residual unfavorability towards Democratic candidates and the Democratic Party, they will nonetheless be more inclined today to vote Democrat than to vote Republican. I do want to share on the one question that I think it was Chinbo who had. So among millennial Vietnamese, so those who are in the way that we categorize it, those who are 18 to 34 years of age, there is a greater likelihood of being Democrat in your identification than Republican. It's not overwhelming by comparison, at least from the quick numbers that I have run. While Karthik was answering the first part of the question, it's not overwhelming by comparison to Vietnamese Americans who are 35 years of age or older. The other thing that we found in previous surveys is that some of the reasons for why Vietnamese Americans seem to be more democratic in their voting patterns by comparison to previous elections is a little bit of a change over time from Vietnamese Americans viewing a lot of politics in the U.S. through kind of a post-Cold War lens, where issues of foreign policy and strength or hawkishness in foreign policy were especially important to a community that is much more inclined to also take seriously a lot of the kind of meat and potato domestic political issues around education, healthcare, and so on as really important and decisive in thinking about how they will vote.
Great. We have Christopher. Is there really a reliable set of shared AAPI concerns? If so, how do we compare to other subpopulations? For their survey, how were the categories chosen? Example, economy, marijuana, refugees.
So in terms of the questions that we chose, some of these questions are repeated questions from what was asked in a spring 2016 survey of Asian American registered voters by API Vote and AAJC. And those themselves were chosen from consultation with communities on some issues that would be relevant. Some of these issues, like marijuana legalization, is on the ballot in California. And what that suggests is that Asian Americans, if marijuana legalization fails, or if it's a close vote, that Asian Americans, being 12% of the voting population in California, will play an important role in that decision. There are other questions that we plan to ask in a post-election survey on other issues, but given limited space, these are the questions that we asked. On the question about what an Asian American agenda looks like, it's this survey in the context of many other surveys, which show, broadly speaking, that Asian Americans support either a progressive agenda or an agenda that tends to line up with the Democratic Party on things like support for increased taxes, more social spending, support for universal health care when we asked in 2008, support for the Affordable Care Act. And this is not just our surveys. Pew has found this, as well as other survey organizations.
Clarice asks, do you think, particularly among foreign-born participants, that the political climates from their home countries frame their political leanings decisions in the U.S.? And then Keith Kamasugi is asking, were there any questions related to Asian Americans and Latinos?
So maybe Janelle, you want to take the foreign-born question, or Jennifer?
No, I'll let Janelle take that, and I would like to take the second question about Asian Americans and Latinos.
Okay, so I think the question was, does the experience of Asian Americans prior to immigration with the kind of political context in their country of origin matter for Asian Americans in the United States? And we do see some evidence that that's the case. We see that for reasons having to do with the political context in the country of origin, Vietnamese, for instance, have long been more Republican than other groups, and that has to do with anti-communist sentiment associated with the Republican Party. And in the past, we've actually asked these questions. This is not about framing, but about participation. We know that experiences taking part in politics in the country of origin do affect Asian Americans' political participation in the U.S., and not necessarily in the way you would expect. It doesn't draw them away from politics in the U.S. It actually encourages them to take part in politics in the U.S. So those who participate a lot in their country of origin are more likely to participate in politics in the U.S. as well. But we didn't ask specific questions about foreign policy, specific foreign policies in this survey. In our most important problem question, we did not see foreign policy necessarily rise to the top of Asian American concerns. So that gives you a sense of where those concerns lie vis-a-vis other domestic or U.S.-based concerns.
I actually wasn't sure about the question of Asians and Latinos. If you could repeat that question. Christine?
Were there any questions related to Asian Americans and Latinos?
Okay, I'll answer that in two ways because it can be interpreted in a couple of ways. We did collect data on Latinos, and we haven't analyzed that yet as part of this survey. And so we will analyze those results as they come in. The other thing I wanted to say that is really terrific is that to tantalize people out there is that we will have another survey that focuses on intergroup attitudes. So how do Asian Americans, what do they think about Latinos and African Americans, and also what do they think about other Asian ethnic groups? Oftentimes we think about Asian American as a monolithic category, or other people think that way about Asian Americans. And one of the things we're really interested in testing in the next survey that we're launching in a couple of months is how Asian Americans view one another. And so we'll be asking a number of questions in that regard. We'll also be asking questions about what Asian ethnic groups think about particular Latino groups and African Americans. And so all these exciting data will come out in the next few months. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, if I can jump in also, just to reinforce what both Jennifer and Janelle said. On Jennifer's point, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the report that we are releasing today is just of the first of 2 surveys and just of registered voters. And the project of the 2016 National Asian American Survey as a whole is also really keen on trying to address one issue that typically comes up when you only survey Asian Americans, which is what do we compare this to? So the other parts of our survey project as a whole, which we have not yet fully analyzed and have not yet reported out on, are how Asian Americans compare to fully to Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and also how they compare to white Americans, Latino Americans, and African Americans over the exact same set of questions. So the questions that we are reporting out in terms of where Asian Americans stand today were also asked of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, white Americans, Latino Americans, and African Americans. To the question about how salient foreign policy interests are, or actually maybe more specifically, how salient the politics of Asian Americans' countries of origin are, we actually looked at that specifically with respect to Korean Americans in the 2012 National Asian American Survey, where we asked Korean Americans in our sample what they thought about the trade agreement that the president had negotiated with South Korea, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and also what Korean Americans thought about humanitarian aid towards North Korea. And what you find is that Korean Americans have views on those issues, and if you just compare their views on those issues to their vote choice, it seems to give some shape to their vote choice. But when you include other things that also shape their vote choice, such as their favorability towards the parties, their favorability towards candidates, and their views on a range of other domestic policy issues such as healthcare, education, and immigration, those views on the politics of North and South Korea completely wash away as a significant factor in how they actually vote. So it's not that they don't have opinions, it's not that those opinions don't seem to give some shape, but it really is dominated by a lot of the other things that really matter in terms of shaping vote choice in the United States.
Great. We actually have a number of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and read a number of them. One is nonpartisan equal to independent voters? We also have a comment from Enrique.
That's just a quick one. Let me just do that and then we can go to meeting ones. Nonpartisan includes those who say that they're independent and those who say don't know to that question.
Great. Enrique says, I'm concerned that we did not contact our community more than the survey. Communication by party and community is still lacking. But I think that was just more of a comment. Matthew is asking, what are the key swing states where the Asian American vote is likely to be most critical in this year's elections?
So as we mentioned, some of the states are ones that were important last time, like Nevada and Virginia, but it looks like North Carolina might be in play this year. Georgia might be in play this year. States like Ohio and Florida don't have large Asian American and Pacific Islander populations, but the contest seems to be quite close. Florida always seems to be close. And in the last election, the Asian American voting population was larger than the margin of victory there. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, in almost all of those battleground states that Karthik just mentioned, and I would add, I don't know if you mentioned Pennsylvania, but I would add Pennsylvania as well. The Asian American population growth rate between 2000 and 2010 ranges from 59% for Pennsylvania to 116% for Nevada. And in between there is Florida, where the population growth between those two censuses was about, I think, 76%. So they are small by comparison to Latino voters in those states, but they are really growing in numbers. And as Karthik mentioned, in some states, they exceeded the margin of victory in statewide races in 2014 and 2012. And so there's every reason to believe that Asian Americans could help shape the outcome of particular battleground states' decision with respect to Democrat or Republican.
David asks, I may have missed this, but were these Asians only, or were there categories by if Asian and anything, say African American / Latino / white, they were kept in the sample? Easier version, what percentage were multiracial ethnic? Also, Hung asks, when I do voter registration in Albuquerque, many Vietnamese said they will vote for Trump Republican. I think the number is even higher than what are presented here. I wonder whether it is because it is just us here in Albuquerque.
So on the first question, maybe Jennifer, who does a fair amount of work on racial identification, can speak to that. We don't have numbers to present quite yet on that, but Jennifer, maybe you can say a little bit about how we allowed for people.
We were very cognizant of the high rate of interracial marriage among Asian Americans, and we were also very cognizant of the growing multiracial population among Asian Americans, and we did not want to exclude them from the data, and so we actually asked them how they identify, and if they identified with more than one racial or ethnic category, we asked them again, with which group do you identify with most closely? And so they gave that answer, and if they said, for instance, Chinese and Black, for instance, and we asked them which they identified with most closely, and say someone said Black, then they got a different set of questions. For instance, about ethnic media, instead of asking about Chinese media, they were asked about Black media. I would say that we didn't analyze those results separately, but we are aware that the Asian American multiracial population is growing, and we do intend to look at those results and see how they might differ from those who identify with only one ethnic category or as Asian American.
On the question about Albuquerque, I mean, one thing we always get as survey researchers, not about Albuquerque in particular, but people say, well, I swear so many people that I talk to, or so many people in my network seem to be Trump supporters. I've heard that from Indian Americans, from Chinese Americans. This is what the beauty of a telephone survey is. There might be some limitations to a telephone survey, but there's relative anonymity there. There's also more random sample of individuals than people's social networks to be able to draw upon that information. So it's not to say that Trump has no support. It's not zero. We project that it could be up to 20%. Given the size of the Asian American vote, that could mean close to 1 million voters. So it's not to say that Trump Asian American voters don't exist. They certainly do exist. They're just a small minority.
Vigor asks, based on the survey, what are suggestions for mobilizing students on campuses and to get them to learn about the political issues? Christopher also asks, extending the panel's comments on ethnic-specific media, what other arenas are notable? For example, did the survey data speak to the presumed significance of houses of worship for shaping opinions?
So this is Janelle. In terms of reaching out to young people, we definitely see that millennials look different from older Asian Americans, and it really is in the expected direction. So I think, Karthik, you were the one who mentioned that Asian American millennials look like other millennials to some extent, that they look distinct in terms of their views on race, for instance. They're more progressive, they're more willing to support structural reforms to achieve racial equality, but they're also more progressive on other issues like the environment or on major new spending for to avoid student loans and on healthcare. So what we see is that there actually is an even more pronounced progressive agenda among young people, and they can be reached maybe through an emphasis on these issues. I think we need to go beyond the kind of stereotype that Asian Americans only care about education and the economy, and look at these other important areas of life that Asian Americans feel very strongly about.
I would also say, this is Jennifer, that one of the other things that Janelle had presented is that Asian American millennials are looking and very active on social media platforms and engaging in politics that way. And so I think one really terrific way of reaching Asian American millennial voters and mobilizing them is thinking outside the box and thinking of creative social media platforms to do that. And it seems like there are a number of groups already that are active on Facebook and Twitter and other forms, but that is a way to reach that particular population.
On the question of houses of worship and how Asian American spiritual life matters, we did ask questions on this survey about religious identity and have some information on that. It's not in the slides or the report, but I'll just say quickly that I've been studying this for some time. We see growth in the Asian American community in two directions. One, the number of people, the proportions of people who don't identify with any religious tradition is growing, just like the U.S. population, and more Asian Americans are also becoming evangelical or identify as born again. And so now, if you look around the Asian American community and look at any place in the U.S., the largest ethnic organizations in any Asian American community tend to be evangelical churches. So how does this affect their politics? Those who identify as evangelical, let's say, actually are more conservative on many issues than their non-religious or non-evangelical counterparts, but they look incredibly different from white evangelicals. For many of the reasons you see here presented in this survey, they tend to have a much more open attitude towards government intervention to address inequalities in society.
Can I also just add to that, while Janelle was answering the question, I also ran some quick numbers off of our data. And if you run a split between Asian Americans who have religious faith and those who don't, support is higher in a two-way. Support is higher for Clinton over Trump among those who do not have a religious faith. So it's 88 to 12. But even among those who are religious in the Asian American community, Clinton enjoys support over Trump by a 77 to 23 margin. And then the other cut at the data is among Asian Americans in our sample who self-identify as fundamentalist and evangelical. And there's a little bit more of a difference. So for Asian Americans who identify as fundamentalists or evangelical, Clinton still outpolls Trump, but the margin is 61 to 39. And among those who don't, it's substantially larger.
Great. Elena asked, if election was today, asked, what is the return on outreach post-debate? For AAPIs, when is the ideal time to do outreach? GOTV post-new registration, pre-debate, post-debate, the last weekend of the elections. Also, Aries asked question regarding page 44 of the survey. It says, Hmong and Asian Indians most likely to use social media for political engagement, 29% and 23%. But the chart that follows shows Filipino Americans and Asian Indians have 34 and 33 respectively. What explains this?
So I'll take the that second one. I answered privately, but I'll say to everyone in the group. We were pulling data from a couple of different places. So one of them might be for registered voters as opposed to adults. So we will fix that right after the call and issue a correction and note that on the PDF as well. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. And what was in terms of if the election were held today, these were surveys that were done from mid-August till the end of September. We're continuing to do these interviews, and we will analyze in later this month to see if there's any change over time as we get closer to election day in terms of people's vote intention. In terms of voter outreach, Christine, maybe you can answer that in terms of what's the best time to do GOTV.
So you should really clarify in regards to, there's a time period like right now where there's been a big push with National Voter Registration Day that was celebrated last week. We essentially have 7 to 14 days, depending on your state, before the voter registration deadlines actually occur. So just because there's been a lot more marketing done right now, this is the best time to get in those last minute registrations. And then after that, it really is about focusing on early voting and get out the vote. Studies have shown that if you could get someone to think through the day about how they're going to actually vote, either on election day or utilizing absentee or early voting, they're more likely to actually cast that vote. Moving on to the question, Clarice asked, roughly what percentage of native-born participants are millennials? And Marita asked, do you all ask about whether the respondents were planning to go vote this election or how likely they were to actually vote?
I can do the millennial question really quickly because I ran those numbers earlier if you want, Karthik. So
yeah, go ahead.
So I think in the U.S. born bucket, I think more than 1 out of 3 are 18 to 34-year-olds, and then in the foreign-born part of our sample of registered voters, it's about 1 out of 10.
In terms of the question, can you repeat Marita's question? She had a couple of questions that I saw. Which is the question that you mentioned, Christine?
I'll go ahead and read off a couple of her questions. Do you all ask about whether the respondents were planning to go vote this election or how likely they were to actually vote? And then her second question is, we tend to characterize immigration as a critical issue for AAPI communities, but the survey results demonstrate that immigration is a low priority. What are your thoughts on why this is?
So maybe Teku or Janelle can run the numbers on the likely voters. I'll say, since I'm controlling the screen here, and I don't want to do mess it up. But
can you repeat what I'm running again, and I'll do it.
What proportion of the registered voters? So just run the weighted analysis, or say that they're likely to vote, very likely, or somewhat likely to vote. In terms of immigration, this is something that we've seen in prior surveys of Asian Americans, and in fact, even among Latinos, it's very rare to see immigration as the #1 issue, and many times not even the #2 issue. For Asian Americans, I have never seen it break into the top 3. And so it's tempting to think that immigration doesn't matter. But immigration matters in 2 ways that we've seen. One is that Asian American communities seem to be looking at candidate rhetoric on immigration as a sign of whether their communities are respected or not. We saw this in 2014 in a survey with the AJC and API vote, and also in 2016. And so they certainly are sensitive to immigration rhetoric. Immigration also matters in the sense that Asian Americans are the most heavily immigrant racial group in the United States. So when we understand issues like health, issues like education, and issues like language access, immigration and immigrant status and immigration background plays a centrally important role in terms of how people face barriers, and experience life and politics in the United States. So it's not to say that immigration is not important, it's just not explicitly called out as a policy issue that Asian American registered voters flag.
Yeah, I think Asian American voters in this sense are different from Latino voters, where a lot of the poll data show that it is the single most decisive issue in terms of their vote choice between Democratic and Republican presidential candidates. On the earlier question about what percentage of registered voters indicate that they're absolutely certain that they're going to vote, the figure is almost 86%. And to give a little bit of comparison, I also do some polling work for Latino decisions, and for Latino voters, the figure is also very similar, where among registered voters, the group that is certain that they're going to vote is about in the 85% range.
Deanna asks, we heard the stat that 70% of Asian Americans have not been contacted by the parties. Do we know if they are contacted by groups for or against propositions? And also, someone also asked, do you report data by state?
So we, if you look at our slide deck and some of the tables in our report, one thing I also noticed, just multitasking too much, is that some of the page breaks are a little off in our report, so we'll fix that as well when we also do the number check. So we do have state data in the report, certainly have many more of the state data in the slide deck that you will see. In terms of, what was the first question?
State level data.
Oh, the mobilization.
Yeah, mobilization.
Right. So, I mean, we didn't ask about that proposition mobilization this time around, but we know from community groups like Advancing Justice LA and other groups in California that campaigns that try to win a yes or no vote on ballot propositions are very unlikely to put out ads in Asian ethnic media and to target Asian American voters, and that's a significant lost opportunity. We didn't have any ballot proposition questions per se, although we did ask about marijuana legalization here. In the past, we found that about a third of Asian American registered voters say they don't know how they'll vote on a ballot proposition. And if you do the math, 12% of the voting population multiplied by about a third who say they don't know, that's 4% of the total vote on a ballot proposition in California. So that's an incredibly it's a missed opportunity for proponents either on the yes side or a no side to do outreach to API communities.
Going back to reporting data by state, there was also a question by Jem. Isn't it also true that national data do not predict what the API population in any particular state will look like?
So
well, it depends in part on how many respondents in our national. So our survey is designed to be representative of the national Asian American, and then when we report out on NHPI's AAPI population. And the answer to that question is it depends on what state you're looking at and how many people in our sample are from that state. So if you did a nationally representative sample of Asian Americans with about 2,000 respondents, it's entirely reasonable to expect about 40% of that 2,000 to come from California. So it's, the results that we would report out for California are likely to be quite robust because the sample size is going to be about 800 or so. If you drill down to states like Minnesota or Iowa or Georgia, where we might be interested in what's going to happen in the election, but even out of a survey of 2,000 respondents, chances are there will maybe be only a few dozen respondents from those battleground states, and then it becomes a lot harder to say with a great deal of confidence, just because the margin of error is a lot higher, where Asian Americans stand either on the issues or between the candidates for those states that have smaller AAPI populations.
That said, if you look at our slide deck up on the website, you'll see it reported out for any state where there were more than 75 registered voters. And I mean, granted, there are significant margins of error, but one of the things you'll see on those point estimates there aren't huge differences. Even if you look at Asian Americans in Texas, someone might think Asian Americans in Texas would be strong Trump supporters, like other people in Texas. And what we find is that Asian Americans in Texas support Clinton by overwhelming margins, similar to the kind of pattern we find at the national level. Similarly, when it comes to party ID. So while state of residence matters, this is something we found in prior surveys as well. Being Asian American and the experience of being a racial minority in the United States and being Asian in particular is powerful regardless of where people live, and not just in terms of state, but also if they live in dense cities as opposed to suburban areas.
Christopher asked, did the survey design account for AAPI U.S. citizens abroad, absentee foreign nationals outside the U.S.? He also asked, assuming data disaggregation is preferred, how might the survey design better represent differences within each party that transcend the two-party plus pure independent categorizations? Could you forecast what we might hope to learn given findings so far?
Well, it would be great to be able to make international phone calls and or other ways to contact the overseas population. I think each time we do this, we try to improve on our methodology. Moving forward, we're probably going to have to do more mixed mode with a combination of telephone with internet. In the case of the overseas population, that probably should help to cover it. But there are all sorts of sampling challenges that would present themselves. Maybe Teku, Jennifer, or Janelle can take the second question.
Sure. I think if I understand where the questioner is coming from, I think we're in a almost, at least in terms of where voters are, for many voters, we're kind of in a post-partisan moment where a lot of voters are seeing how nasty and polarized the two parties are getting, and choosing to essentially opt out. So the trends over the last several decades in terms of the rise of independents and nonpartisans in the United States are pretty striking. They're almost unprecedented in number. And then if you look at a group like Asian Americans, as we reported out earlier, the rates of Asian Americans who vote Democratic are extremely high, but the rates of Asian Americans who will then say, well, I think of myself as a Democrat, are a lot lower. And in fact, about 40% or more in our sample say, I'm neither a Democrat or a Republican. And of that 40%, only 24% say explicitly, I'm an independent. And the other 16% are respondents who are saying, I don't know how to answer this question. I don't think in terms of these labels like Democrat, Republican, or independent, or they're saying, I may have partisanship, but I'm not going to share it with a stranger over a telephone. So beyond Democrat, Republican, and independent, 16%, which is about 1 out of 6 respondents in our sample, are just opting out of this partisan way of categorizing our politics. So I think that is also, Asian Americans in that sense are reflecting this kind of post-partisan moment or mood that a lot of American voters seem to be in.
Great. We only have a couple more questions left. We need help in engaging 501c3 organizations in voter registration. If they know your party affiliation, they are skeptic about your nonpartisan voter registration advocacy. What are some of the best practices?
Christine, that might be better suited for you.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yes. So one of the things is one, if you are with an organization that has not done this work, please contact API Vote. We actually are always looking for more partners. The more organizations that actually do this work, as well as doing it year-round, incorporating it into your everyday programming is the best strategy instead of just focusing on a presidential year. We actually need to increase voter registration efforts every single year and focus on also local elections. In addition, I would like to encourage everyone to not assume that your family and friends are actually registered. The best thing is to actually have a direct conversation. Even though social media is really great to amplify the message, we found that studies have shown that the direct interaction with the individual to a family or friend is the most effective way to actually get them to register and to actually participate in voting. Then one last question that we have is, at the August AAPI forum in Las Vegas, candidates representatives spent a lot of time on area issues such as TPP. Do your data confirm the admittedly subjective impression that the representative presidential campaigns are mostly unaware, ignorant of issues most important to AAPIs?
I'll just say quickly, if you look at the most important problem, foreign policy concerns are pretty low among on the mind of Asian American voters. So that is something that I think often candidates and sometimes even news media might think that if you're Asian American, given the high proportion of foreign-born, that they care about foreign policy issues first and foremost. And certainly some of the loudest people who are active in terms of trying to get in touch with members of Congress or senators or news organizations might have very strong preferences on foreign policy issues, but we don't find that among the general Asian American electorate.
Yeah, I mean, if I can, the other thing to add on, foreign policy is a big bucket, and trade is one of many areas, and the thing with where Asian Americans stand in terms of U.S. trade policy is, as Karthik said, it's not very salient, but also a lot of it really depends on how you frame the issue. So if you frame it in terms of economic growth, this is from other polling that I've done, if you frame it in terms of economic growth, then voters are going to be a lot more supportive of the idea of trade policy. But if you frame it in terms of a trade-off with jobs in the United States, if you frame it in terms of labor's opposition to trade policy, then the support goes substantially down. So not very salient, and also potentially an issue that really depends on how you frame things. And Asian Americans in the 2012 survey that we did are a group that are a lot more favorable towards labor unions and have a lot more union members among them than I think is appreciated in the general public.
Actually, one last question from Enrique. What is the total Asian population? Oh, sorry. What is the total Asian voting percentage in national elections?
So you look at the 2012 current population survey, which uses self-identified reports on people whether they voted, but the good thing about the CPS is that it's we're not trying to infer people's racial identification. That shows that 47% of eligible adults, so adult citizens of the U.S., voted in 2012. It's unclear yet. We see a fair amount of enthusiasm in other surveys of the Asian American population. But this is a population that is predominantly foreign-born, has not had as much experience in U.S. politics, and importantly, is not getting mobilized still, right? So while there may be significant interest among nonprofits to mobilize Asian American voters, there's still a huge gap between how parties mobilize, or in fact don't mobilize, Asian Americans as opposed to non-Hispanic whites, and that gap needs to be eliminated in order to see any appreciable uptick in Asian American voting participation. That's my take, but others might have other thoughts too.
Well, I think we need to go ahead and wrap up. Jennifer, Karthik, and Teku, are there any final thoughts from any of you?
Be on the lookout for more out of this project, and feel free to call any of us with follow-up questions.
Yeah, I would just echo what Taiku and Karthik said, and also just say that I think one of the things that stands out for me from looking at this data is how progressive Asian American voters are on a number of issues. and in particular how progressive Asian American millennials are and U.S. born Asians are on a number of issues which might surprise the American public and media.
And then I'll just end by thanking Christine Chen from API Vote for being the publicity partner on this conference, and we're seeing a fair amount of interest already on social media for this survey. So if people are interested and have questions, please email us, or if you can call us if you have our numbers, or also tweet at us, and we will get back to you.
Thank you, everyone, for all your participation. Thank you to Jennifer, Janelle, Karthik, and Teku for all your leadership on this. As a reminder to everyone, a follow-up email will be sent to everyone who has registered for this webinar with links to the actual webinar and to the report itself. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.